With Bartleby, this is monotonous, I prefer not to. Left to themselves, the class would have renamed the story as Bartleby, in a Jim Carrey accent, the loser. The student's question was as interesting as it was legitimate. In a way, she was asking me to legitimate my pedagogical choices. I must have chosen these texts on the assumption that they had something significant and valuable to impart to the world at large, to my class in particular. I began my measured and serious pedagogical response with a reference to Martin Heidegger and his famous claim that it is when equipmentality breaks down, the critical knowledge is gained. And they got it right away. I tell her that when things are happy and normal, life is asymptomatic. And because it is asymptomatic, we assume that what is normal is real. In fact, I assure her that happiness too is a symptom, perhaps a 0-degree symptom. And that happiness and sadness, or for that matter, normalcy and abnormalcy, are not opposed states of existence, but rather states within a continuum. The so-called abnormal or exceptional situations are in fact as representative of the human condition as the happy and the well-adjusted situations. I asked her to consider for a moment the enigmatic last lines of Bartleby the Scrivener, Bartleby, humanity. If Bartleby were indeed that eccentric or idiosyncratic, why would Melville leave us with a disquieting but profound suggestion that Bartleby's condition is indeed the human condition? It's only that we choose to disavow this insight. Or for that matter, the subtitle of the story, or the story of Wall Street, from whose point of view. Or consider the conclusion of Ellison's Invisible Man that has the narrator addressing us fraternally and insinuating that perhaps on another wavelength, the narrator is speaking for us as well. All of this is to say that the study of literature functions as a critique of any given set of historical circumstances rather than as a justification of the status quo. Am I too fast? Am I doing all right? Okay. What the study of the humanities does at its best is to invoke the human condition both in its singularity as well as in its potential universality. It is not coincidental that Marx and Freud seek examples from literature to dramatize and understand the human condition. As Sir Philip Sidney would argue in his essay, Apology for Poesy, the verisimilitude of literature is in fact more pleasurably and teachably real precisely because of the nature of its generic embodiment. More concretely real than the abstract truths of philosophy and less factually constrained to the truths of history. In fact, in its attempts to invoke and delineate the real, literature refuses complicity as best it can, both with the choiceless après coup facticity or the givenness of history and the abstract and grandstanding didacticism of philosophy. The topos, where literary embodiment happens, is that vital non-space, that in tearing itself away from what is also leaning poignantly but never definitively toward what should be. Between the actual and the ideal, literature performs its practice perspectively and in active partisanship, both as affirmation and as critique. Whenever there is talk about truth or truths, there is an immediate reference to universality. What indeed is a universal truth and how is it anointed by universality? Is Einstein's truth more universal than Marx's or the other way around, and so on and so forth? Are the truths of the humanities more contingent and historically vulnerable than the truths of technology, mathematics, or biology? Does the essence of the human, whatever that may mean, speak transcendentally in the humanities or the sciences? We could respond to these questions along two axes, that of content and that of methodology. We could say, for example, that the stuff of literature, for example, the great themes, man, woman, God, religion, love and hate, self and society, individual and the nation, the so-called eternal and transcendent motifs that constitute the human condition. The problem here is that the public at large is prepared to honor and celebrate the stuff of literature, but not the methodologies that go into the rigorous applications of literary and cultural textuality. The humanities scholar is expected to be naive and uncomplicated, is supposed to be expected to be a naive and uncomplicated generalist who is expected to hold forth about culture and literature innocently and unself-reflexively and even non-methodologically. What the public has difficulty with is in granting the simple practice of reading a methodological and professional value. Who doesn't read? Of course, who does not read is a general perception, but to the humanities scholar, reading is as technical and complex and challenging a task as the astrophysicist's rigorous tracking of a planet's orbit, or the geneticist's understanding of the language or the genetic code. At this point, I'm making a little bit of a break to share with you. How many of you have, I'm sure you have, Edward Said's book, Humanism and Democratic Criticism, with its evocative title. There's a little book and then an admit all stuff inside. And I'm doing a little riff on that in the context of, what is reading? Is reading done in general, out there, in here? Reading as something specialist versus reading as something that is done by everybody commonsensically in a non-professional way. And then I'll come back to my text. And here I'm talking about the way the book works. There is the admit all stub that is inside the book. The long-lasting significance of Said, of his work, and of what he stood for had triumphed. That book cover sums up Said's political, aesthetic, and existential ethic with great grace and sophistication. The semiotics of the stub, and here again the theme is reading as simultaneously something that is done al fresco, as it were, and we should be out there on a day like this, versus reading as something which we do in a classroom and call it exegesis or explication du texte, and give it certain names, and then the question is, what exactly are we admitting in? What is being kind of excluded when reading vacillates between something that everybody does versus something that only some people do? Okay? The semiotics of the stub is complex and multi-layered. The stub that is part of the ticket suggests that entry is limited, but such a restrictive connotation is immediately deconstructed by the all, officially stamped on it. And of course, the ticket functions as a bookmark, and it juts out from the ponderous interiority of a tome. It is as if the ticket nature of the ticket has been called into question and sublimated into a higher and the inclusive authority of the all. But the textual play here that Said would have appreciated so much is the fact that the admittance of the all cannot be achieved in some mystic, transcendent, or a historical mode that would just say all and bypass the disciplinary and institutional modality of admit. The mere factual affirmation of the all does not automatically entail the admittance of the all. The worldliness of the all is real only by virtue of an act of transgressive representation. The authority of the ticket that admits some and not others is maintained under erasure to tell us that admittance is being won and secured in the name of the all. Moreover, the term admit also points to that threshold at which the real is ushered in the form of representation. And in this sense, admittance includes the possibility of legitimation along with the permission to represent. Finally, the imperative mood of the sentence with its implicit subject suggests also a kind of reflexivity. After all, who is saying admit all? As a command, an imperative, a request, an appeal, or as an exhortation? It is humanity inviting itself non-denominationally and in a non-parochial and non-sectarian manner into the world of secular humanism. The exhortation as permission is an immanent critique of a world structured in dominance in which some are admitted so that others may be excluded. And here there was another connotation of the word admit all, which I hadn't quite been alive to when I wrote the book. And my good friend and brilliant colleague Jane Lewis said, but how about admit all as in confess all, as in admit it? So culture as crime, culture as simultaneously a document of barbarism as well as a document of civilization. So in other words, the whole notion of culpability. So I hope you get a sense of what I'm getting at, the generalist versus the specialist. And what does the word generalist mean? And especially when you say someone is a generalist, already you have become a generalist. Okay? And maybe we'll come back to the whole issue of methodology and disciplinarity in the context of the humanities. And, depending on what your agenda is, when is it okay to insist that the humanities be accessible, and you're for it, as Said would be, But on the other hand, if it means a kind of a dumbing down, or if it means a certain kind of insistence that the humanities are just easy stuff, at that point, I guess your point of view could be different, and that might be a fun thing to talk about in the Q&A to see what methodology means to most of you in the context of humanistic studies. So, what about reading? Is reading a poem the same thing as proving a theorem? Do readings lead to inviolable truths that are objective in themselves? Or is objectivity a perspectival construct and truth itself nothing more but an interpretive version? Often at the undergraduate level, I would have a student ask me, how come there are so many interpretations of the same story? I want to know the right answer. Or it all seems so subjective and there is nothing to verify. And that precisely is the point. What the scientific or positivist student perceives as flaws are indeed the defining marks of excellence in the humanities. I tell my student that it is more real and existential for a poem to have multiple meanings and resolutions rather than the one official and programmatically correct answer. What is different is that the humanities invite us to reinvent and re-understand the relationship between objectivity and subjectivity, between particularism and universalism. With Martin Heidegger, who insisted, much to the chagrin of analytic philosophers, that in the humanities it is incumbent to locate the questioner within the question. In other words, objectivity is neither an a priori guarantee, nor is the result of the dissolution of subjectivity. Subjectivity and objectivity are always in process with respect to each other. Humanistic studies thematize rather than disavow the relationship between prejudice or prejudice. I'm rehearsing stuff I'm pretty sure you all know. And partly, it's kind of interesting to symptomatize myself, and I consulted with, Lance and Ian and Erin, what kind of talk should I give? What hat should I wear? Should I do the post-colonial thing, the theory thing? Should I wear motley? Should I have a bunch of hats and keep juggling around and get into a tizzy and then, evaporate? Or should I, the voice of the public intellectual? And here I am doing something kind of, in between, which I'm sure is, for some reason, satisfactory. Other reasons, you're saying, I've heard that stuff before. And that is something I do want to come back to, maybe in the Q&A. So when people say something, it happens always when you go to talks in a university. If it's too technical, you feel like you're alienated. But if it's too simple, you feel like saying, oh God, for this I came to the talk. I knew that already. So what do you want, folks? The writer says something. It's either too simple, as in commonsensical, even platitudinous. I knew that, but did you know that? On the other hand, if the talk becomes too kind of, fancy, invested in a certain kind of discord, it seems like really you're being highfalutin, and you're really being pompous for no reason. So the whole question of what is this thing called profundity, whatever that term might mean, and its very strange fungibility with a cliche. The cliches are profound, and then you say, well, the profundity was not in what you said, but the way Radha said it. Wow, the development of that's what was seductive. Not what he said, which we knew already, but then on the other hand, well, if that's what he had to say that was so simple, why make the methodology seem so daunting and seem de rigueur? And we could come back to that. I keep saying, those are some of the larger issues. I'm just trying to see. I was kind of agonizing. There were 2 or 3 other talks which were much more discursively thick and dense and whatever. Should I have done that? Would that have been more impressive? I wasn't sure. And then the context, who am I addressing? So these are the complications that eventually go into the making of what you think is a shareable thought, a shareable insight, etc., etc. Okay, humanistic studies thematize rather than disavow the relationship between prejudice and knowledge production, between perspectival interference and the construction of objectivity. When we read a text, we open up a hermeneutic dialogue whereby we as readers are read and interrogated by the text as much as the text is read and questioned by us. The humanistic paradigm is an excellent stand-in for social realities that are simultaneously individual and collective, subjective and objective, diachronic and synchronic. Stanley Fish would famously ask, is there really a text in this class? And Derrida would maintain that nothing outside the text. All that Fish and Derrida mean is that we, in the act of studying, are in fact textualizing reality. And the textualization of reality is always perspectival. If something is not considered to be in the text, the res geste, thinking of Perry Mason and the lawyers who constitute the text, and then if it's not in the text, incompetent, immaterial, irrelevant.